So we will start straight away, because we're still on time, with this man who we did mention last week, Charles V. So this is the man who would have received the Mexican Mendoza Codex that we looked at last week. This is also the man who would have received Moctezuma's huge headdress that we looked at. He would have received all of those gifts and shown them around Europe. So I thought it would be interesting to see what he's doing in his home country. He was a very important emperor because he was a Habsburg Habsburg emperor. And I'm not going to do a whole history of the Habsburg Empire because it's too complicated and I don't know it well enough. But very, very briefly, the reason why he was so important is because we've mentioned some of the dynasties that arose in Europe at the end of the Roman Empire, all across Europe. We had, the Visigoths, which we've mentioned, the Frankish Kingdom, the Burgundian Kingdom, the Habsburg dynasty popping up around Europe. And Charles V was really important because basically he was the grandson, let me get this right, I'm checking my notes. He was the grandson of Maximilian I, who had basically joined the Habsburg and Burgundian dynasties. And then on the other side, he was the grandson of Isabella and Ferdinand of Spain. So suddenly, thanks to this king, you're basically ruling huge parts of France, Austria, the Netherlands, Spain, and, considering Spain had already gone to the New World, to Mexico, all of those areas as well. So he's basically in charge of a huge, huge bit of land. And you can see in his portraits, if we go to the next ones, that for him, his self-representation is really important. He's a little bit younger on the left, a little bit older on the right. And all of his portraits are kind of very traditional symbols of power. Like his horse is always made to look like it's bowing to him. So he's always kind of portrayed as being very in control.
Yeah, big coat.
Let me just make sure everyone's muted so that it's quiet for everyone. There we go. So yeah, this is Charles V, just to give you some context of who was actually receiving the stuff that we were looking at last week. But what you will notice about him, seeing as this is an art history class, is that all of the paintings that I've shown you are by the same artist, Titian. So you've got these two by Titian and also this one. And I just wanted to start by looking at Titian because he is one of my favorite painters and also he's important. So Titian basically, he lived until he was, I think, like 88 or something, almost 90. So he has so many paintings, you'll find them in so many museums. He continued working until like the very end of his life. So he's kind of seen as one of the big four Renaissance Italian artists, alongside Michelangelo, Leonardo, and Raphael. And the four of them are kind of like, I don't know, the keystone Renaissance artists. And what I've always found interesting about Titian is that he hasn't kind of, in our day and age, he hasn't got the same recognition as the big names of Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. I've always felt like his reputation is lacking a bit now, which is interesting because at the time he was probably more famous than any of them. He was sought after to be court painter for all of these different royals. Yeah, he was just extremely, extremely famous. And I just want to say that his style was very different to Michelangelo's, Leonardo's, Raphael's. So we'll just briefly cover this. If you go to the next slide, you've got Michelangelo's very typical Sistine Chapel image on the right, and then you've got a late Titian painting on the left. And Titian's later paintings are better examples than his portraits of how different his style was. He used much thicker paint. His brushstrokes were much looser. His use of color was really different, which you can see in these paintings. He wasn't so interested in anatomy and muscle and the human body, which set him apart totally from most Italian Renaissance artists. So that's why I've always found him really interesting, because it's quite radical, his style of painting, given what his contemporaries were doing. And he, you know, Titian went on to inspire so many artists, Rubens, Rembrandt, you know, even the Impressionists in the 19th century. So he's really important. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that one of the best ways to kind of notice the difference between the four big Renaissance artists is actually to look at their drawings. And I couldn't help but include this because there have been so many good drawing exhibitions recently. I hope you can see, let me move my screen a bit to the right. These are 4 drawings by Titian, Leonardo, Raphael, Michelangelo, and you can really see the stylistic differences when you go to a drawing exhibition. And I haven't labeled these purposely, just to kind of give you a bit of time to decide who you think is who. That makes sense, like to try and start distinguishing between the different Renaissance artists. So you know from the Michelangelo sculptures that we looked at a few weeks back that he was very interested in muscle definition and anatomy. Lots of people know that Leonardo was also an engineer, so he was also really interested in detail. And Raphael's Renaissance paintings are kind of more famous for their beauty. He's very famous for the way that he draws beautiful faces. And Titian is just completely different because his drawings are rough, really fast. His painting is really thick. Anyway, so he's a really interesting artist. Probably by now you will start to understand who is who in this arrangement. So you've got Titian on the left and Raphael on the right. Yeah, so I've always thought, you know, if you want to start learning how to distinguish between artists, it's actually often easier to look at their drawings than their paintings. Anyway, this is a complete tangent from Charles V. And all I really wanted to say on this topic is that Titian was really Charles V's favorite painter. And there's kind of lots of anecdotes about the two of them. And one of them basically says that if Titian, you know, that Titian once dropped his paintbrush while he was painting a portrait of Charles V, and Charles picked it up for him, which was, you know, crazy because he was a royal and all of this stuff. So this was his favorite painter. And the other thing, the other tangent that I wanted to mention, because there will probably be lots of tangents today, because it's just how I feel, is that this painting of Charles V, who is also sometimes called Charles I, by the way, because he's seen as kind of the first king to unify all of Spain. This is by Van Dyck and it's later, but whenever I'm talking about Charles V or painting, I have to include this portrait because it's just my favorite. I just think this is better than all of the Titian ones that we saw above. I just find it more interesting and really unique. I've never seen anything like this. And actually it was meant to be a study for a bust, like a sculptural bust, which is why they needed lots of different angles. So it was just meant to be a purely functional work, but it was so beautiful in the end that it was kept as a work of art in its own right. So yeah, this is just a side note, a really nice painting if anyone wants to look further into it. The last thing to say about Charles V, just tying into everything we did last week, is that there are lots of Renaissance, moving into the Baroque period, paintings of his conquests in the New World. And you can see kind of all the typical symbols that you'd expect, the globe, the gold, because that's what the Spanish were really interested in Central and South America. On the right, you've got a painting with lots of olive branches, which were symbols of holiness and peace, which is kind of ironic given the brutality of the conquests. But it was for Charles V important to promote this image of himself as the leader of the empire. You know, the sun never sets on the Spanish Empire was the first time that that saying was said. So yeah, I had to include these to give you a sense of what was happening in Spain in this period. But what you will notice is that we haven't talked about any Spanish artists yet. And that is well, not on purpose, but it's kind of important to notice, because the reason why we haven't talked about Spanish artists is because there is this idea in the history of art, which is slowly starting to be revisited, that Spanish artists didn't really have a Renaissance. So traditionally the Renaissance is always very heavily based in Italy, and you know, sometimes in France. I suppose there are some good French artists around this time, but there is this idea that Spain in the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, it was still ruled by Islamic kingdoms, so it didn't have a Renaissance. And therefore, when Ferdinand and Isabella reconquered Spain in 1492, and then their grandson, Charles V, became emperor, they had to use Italian artists because Spain didn't have its kind of good artists yet. That is the idea promoted by kind of the most traditional old art histories. And this is the first part of Spanish art that we will kind of deconstruct, because it's just not true. In the 14th and 15th centuries, Spain was producing loads and loads of art under the Nazareth Kingdom, which was the last Islamic kingdom of Spain. So, I mean, it looks nothing like the Italian Renaissance, it's just different. But nonetheless, this is, you know, some of the most important and beautiful works of art that we have in this period of history. Probably the most famous kind of 13th, 14th century Spanish art of this period is architecture. Like, lots of people are familiar with the Alhambra and the Great Mosque of Cordoba. But other important things that they produced were ceramics and metalworks. And I just wanted to include these two necklaces, Nazareth necklaces from the late 15th century, because they basically teach you about the diversity of religions in Islamic Spain. So obviously there were lots of Muslims, but there were also many Christians and many Jews. So these two necklaces were both Nazareth, and they are both made in the same technique, which is kind of these enamel flower patterns sunk into the gold. But one of the necklaces, the necklace on the left, says, let me get it right, "Glory is God's alone" in Arabic. And the other one on the right says, "Hail Mary, full of grace" in Latin. So even though they're both made in the same way, from the same region, in the same period, both Nazareth, they appeal to different religious groups. So, you know, they basically teach us a lot about religious tolerance in the period, and artists were basically used to appealing to lots of different religious groups and selling their works of art to lots of different groups. So you often have Christian Islamic works of art, for example. And this has caused a lot of debate in the history of art about whether the term Islamic art is actually a useful term, because we don't necessarily use the term Christian art, because they're words that have really heavy religious connotations, and sometimes they're not useful when you encounter lots of works of art which exist in the world, which are both Christian and Islamic, for example. So these works of art probably are a good reminder that often it's more useful to use words that are geographically and historically specific, like Nazareth or Andalusian instead of the kind of broad brush word Islamic. So I just thought it was interesting to mention that debate. And before we continue with Spanish art, I just had to include this because this is, again, there's going to be so many tangents today, but bear with me. This is probably the most important and best example in the history of art that we have of Christian Islamic art. And this is, it's called the Freer Canteen, made in the mid-13th century in Ayyubid Syria. So Syria was at this point ruled by a Muslim empire, the Ayyubid Empire, but there were lots of Christians living there. There were also lots of crusaders passing through. So the artists wanted to appeal to both Muslims and Christians. And so what you get is these works of art that have, you know, for example, the Virgin and Child in the middle, and actually lots of nativity scenes as well on this work of art. But with Arabic inscriptions glorifying the Ayyubid Sultan around the edge. So, you know, now we would look at this and think that it's a fusion work of art, but there are lots of historians who say that you shouldn't even consider this a fusion because it was just made to appeal to two groups that weren't seen as totally radically opposite at the time. So it's really important to look at these works of art and remember that they exist in such a different religious context to the one that we exist in now. And Spain is a great example of that, super rich in that type of art history. So yeah, so I had to mention that. And then basically going back to Spain, what happened in 1492 when Ferdinand and Isabella reconquered Spain. They expelled the Muslims, they expelled the Jews. They did not practice the kind of religious tolerance that we've just been speaking about. But what they did do is kind of, perhaps hypocritically, retain this admiration for Nazareth architecture and all of the kind of architectural legacy that they'd inherited. And what you get is something called mudéjar art. I will spell it in the notes. And it's a fusion of Christian and Islamic architecture, or maybe better said, Renaissance and Nazareth architecture. And the Alcazar of Seville, which is what we're looking at now, is one of the earliest examples of this type of architecture. So it was built, well, it started to be built in 1364. And that's because Spain conquered, or rather, the Spanish kings conquered Islamic Spain in stages. And this is in Seville, which had been conquered in, I don't think I have it in my notes, 1264, I think, something like that. So it was already in the Spanish possession, and it was made by one of the monarchs who preceded Isabella and Ferdinand, called Peter of Castile. And yeah, he obviously really, really admired the Nazareth architecture that he was inheriting. And alongside the decoration on the outside that you can see here, the palace is actually full of Arabic inscriptions and tiling inside. And this inscription actually says, "There is no victory without Allah," which seems crazy because this was built by a Christian king. But again, you have to understand that Allah is just the Arabic word for God. So he is saying there is no victory without God. And lots of these religious motifs were seen to be applicable to many different monotheistic religions. So yeah, I really think that this ceramic work and metal work and this architecture of this period is some of the most interesting to look at in the 21st century, when we have such rigid ideas of religious groups. So I had to mention this. One of the most famous examples of mudéjar architecture, so architecture that fuses kind of Spanish Renaissance with Islamic Nazareth architecture, is the Great Mosque of Cordoba, which lots of people have heard of. It's got these Islamic arches in the, well, that dominate the building basically, but it has this Catholic cathedral slap bang in the middle, which was actually built by or commissioned by Charles V, which takes us back to him. So when he became emperor, that's one of the first things that he did. But again, we've spoken a lot about architecture in these classes and about how it does teach us about, I mean, maybe not necessarily religious tolerance in this case because the Muslims were expelled, but this kind of admiration for different architectural styles, which is really interesting. So we're now going to leave Islamic Spain behind and talk about what happened after Charles V, because traditional art histories will tell you that this is kind of, you know, the Spanish Golden Age. Spain now enters this, you know, phase of huge artistic, literary, musical production, and this is when you start to see Spanish painters, most famously Velázquez. You know, as I've said, these golden age periods are often misleading because they kind of imply that there was nothing before, but actually the Nazareth period of Spain is super rich, like we've just seen. But nonetheless, the Spanish Golden Age did produce some really great Spanish painters, and often really famous paintings in the history of art, like Las Meninas or Picasso's Guernica or the Mona Lisa, are kind of end up being famous for being famous. But Las Meninas is really an exception because it really deserves its fame. Like when we talk about this painting, you'll see that it's one of the paintings that it was really radical in its time, and it remains just as important today. So some people will be familiar with this painting, I assume, so sorry if you know everything that I'm going to tell you, but nonetheless, I will continue. So basically, Velázquez was court painter to Philip IV, who was by this point the great-grandson or the grandson of Charles V, great-grandson. And yeah, he had the best job you could possibly have at that point as a painter. And this is kind of his most important work that he left behind. He did lots of paintings of the royal family, but this is the most unusual one. The first reason why it's unusual is because it looks like a photograph. It looks like a snapshot. Almost everyone in this painting is moving. You've got the person moving up the stairs, someone turning to the princess in the middle. Velázquez is picking up his paintbrush. And this was really radical at the time. Like if you think back to the portraits that we started with of Charles I, only a few decades before, royal portraits were really rigid and formulaic. And they weren't kind of seen as these works of art that allowed, you know, experimentation with composition and all this stuff. So that's the first reason why it's really radical. The second reason why this painting is so famous is because it takes attention away from the royals, which is quite, like, I mean, political. So at the back here, you've got a mirror, and in this mirror is the king and the queen. So this is Philip IV. And then at the front, you've got the Princesa Margarita, their daughter. And then you've also got her attendants. You've got two attendants here. And then you've got, he's not a palace attendant at the back. I can't remember his name. A palace official. Here, and then a self-portrait of Velázquez here on the left. So all these different figures. And then you've got the court dwarves on the front right. So you're not really sure who to focus on. Obviously, the princess in the middle is lit up. But what some art historians have noted about this painting that is so unusual is that the center of the painting, if you look at the vanishing point and do the kind of maths of it all, is actually the palace official. He's kind of, his square is the very middle of the painting. So this painting basically seems to be saying, look at all of the different components that make up the royal family, the painters and the attendants and the officials who live around them and kind of sustain them. And in really subtle ways that don't kind of offend the monarchy, Velázquez like gives these people attention when they're normally completely erased from history. You know, to have the king and queen as the smallest elements of your huge portrait, because this painting is massive, is really, really unusual in this period. And probably the most famously, you know, the last and most famously unusual part of this painting is that this huge square thing on the right, people don't actually know what it is. Some people have suggested that it's a painting of the king and the queen, which is being reflected in the mirror behind. And some people have suggested that it's Las Meninas, it's the canvas that we're looking at, and that Velázquez was painting in front of a huge mirror in order to incorporate himself into the painting. And we just don't know. Apparently it has the exact same dimensions as the painting we're looking at, which does suggest that he was painting in front of a mirror. But even that is quite radical for the time, for a painter to include himself. And some art historians have suggested that this whole painting was basically made to celebrate the arts and really elevate painting, because it wasn't seen as the highest form of art, you know, like poetry or music. So painters were really trying to establish themselves as important parts of society. And actually the two paintings above, which you can see here, he leaves just enough detail that we actually know exactly what these paintings are. And they're two Rubens paintings, both mythological. I won't go into loads of detail about them, but they both basically tell stories where the arts are involved and they come out, you know, triumphant. So they tell stories about kind of the power of the arts, because obviously Greek mythology really elevates the arts. So it could be that this whole royal painting actually wasn't about the royal family that it depicts, but was actually about the act of painting itself and the painter, which it's really hard to get across just how original that was at the time, you know. And that's why I like to kind of compare it to the portraits of Charles V, which are so, I mean, uninventive compared to this. I mean, I do love Titian paintings, but still. So yeah, we haven't done kind of a lot of visual and what we call visual analysis in this class, where you really dedicate yourself to one painting and try and understand it. But I thought it was really worth doing with this painting, which is kind of the most famous painting of the Spanish Golden Age. Before we move on from the Spanish Golden Age, I will mention the other paintings that are really famous in this period by artists like Zurbarán and Murillo. So they're characterized often by their darkness and kind of somberness, if that's a word. If you think about what you normally imagine as the Renaissance, kind of images of the Virgin and Child, lots of chubby babies, Spanish painting was completely different to that. It was much more pious, much more kind of introspective and more like painful. And it's, you know, it kind of makes sense when you consider the context of the Counter-Reformation. Things were very unstable religiously and politically, and Spanish artists were trying to prove that painting still had a place in religious worship. So they made these incredibly moving and pious paintings. So that's another type of painting that's associated with the Spanish Golden Age. It's not just Velázquez and the court paintings. But even Velázquez's paintings, if you look at them, have a much darker color palette than the Italian artists that we were looking at before. So, and I just had to include this sculpture before we move on as well. Again, another really famous Spanish Golden Age work of art. And I just had to include this to remind you as well that it wasn't just painting. In Spain, they were very famous in this period for their wooden religious sculptures. And there's an amazing museum in Valladolid full of these sculptures. And they were functional, they were used in religious processions, and they were also used in churches. And you have to imagine that they weren't meant to be seen how we're seeing them on the screen now. They were meant to be seen in very dark, like candlelit cathedrals. So the idea was that you would come across this extremely, you know, intensely lifelike sculpture, and it would kind of provoke this religious experience for you. So it's really hard for us to recreate their original function now, but these sculptures are still used in Spain for religious parades, and actually all of the, well, not all, but a lot of the religious sculptures in the Valladolid Museum of, you know, wooden sculpture of the Spanish Golden Age come out every Easter for the religious processions. So they're still functional objects. And yeah, and I must stress that the purpose was to be lifelike. And in this Pedro de Mena sculpture, he actually uses real hair and eyelashes, and also these glass balls for the eyes to really like try and bring it to life. And you can see that he includes the tears in this like wax that makes them look really real. So yeah, Spanish Golden Age painting and sculpture I've always found much more emotional, and they really focus on the kind of sad, more difficult parts of the Christian story. Like if you see Spanish Golden Age crucifixions, they'll often be much bloodier and much sadder, and the point was really to move people. So that is all I will say about the Spanish Golden Age, which is already loads because I've been talking a lot. But oh yeah, I have also included this, but this is just because this is one of my favorite Spanish Golden Age paintings. You do also get still lifes. Again, they're dark, religious, so they kind of fit the theme, but I just love this one. I love the texture. So so yeah, but I will not analyze any more Spanish Golden Age paintings. I will just say that the Spanish Golden Age went on to basically influence all of the most famous Spanish artists. And I'm not going to talk very much about Picasso, but if you go to the Picasso Museum in Barcelona, they have these rooms that are basically just dedicated to Picasso's obsession with Velázquez's Meninas. He made all sorts of interpretations of this painting. Yeah, maybe even hundreds, honestly. The walls are just covered with his reimaginations of Las Meninas in the Cubist style, in whatever style, in black and white, in color. He just did tons of them. But I'm not going to focus on Picasso's interpretation. Instead, I'm going to talk about Dali and how Velázquez and the Golden Age really inspired Dali, who is a surrealist, who I think we've mentioned some surrealism so far, but we haven't done like a full dedicated session to it. So we're in the 20th century, and the Spanish Golden Age is still having this huge influence on the artists. And Dali loved Velázquez so much. He had this huge library dedicated to him. He said that his mustache was kind of a tribute to Velázquez. He was totally obsessed with this painter. And I wanted to include this example of Dali's tributes to Velázquez, because he made many paintings that directly referenced Velázquez's work, but I wanted to include this one because it gives us a chance to talk about Velázquez's many portraits of dwarfs. You saw some of them in Las Meninas. He includes 2 of the court dwarfs. And I just mention them because there's lots of art historical scholarship written about them, because it's kind of thought that Velázquez humanized dwarfs, or began very slowly to kind of criticize the court's treatment of them. He stopped painting them performing, for example. Instead, he just painted them sitting down, like you see here, not smiling as the court wanted them to. So some people have really politicized his portraits of dwarfs. That's all I'll say about it, because there's so much online about Velázquez's dwarfs. But the painting on the right, which is Dali's reimagination, is much more difficult to interpret. We basically have no idea what's going on in this painting, which is the case with many of Dali's paintings. And it's called Velázquez dying, so we don't really know what's going on. But the fried egg was like a really important symbol for Dali and for all of the Surrealists, to be honest. It was kind of a symbol of life and death at the same time, fragility, but also strength. It was just, for them, it was like a TARDIS, this food that had so many different symbolic connotations, and Dali loved it. And it appears, I mean, he's got that really famous melting eggs painting, if you Google it. But some people have also said that the reason why he puts fried eggs in this tribute to Velázquez is because of one of Velázquez's most famous paintings. I will do this so that you can see it a bit better, which is called Old Woman Frying Eggs. I mean, I said I wouldn't speak anymore about the Spanish Golden Age, but here we are. And this is, I had to include this actually, and I do really want to talk about it because this is just one of my favorite paintings, and in my eyes, like the best painting of the Spanish Golden Age. I probably shouldn't say that, but it's true. And so some people think that Dali kind of has taken the fried eggs from this Velázquez painting that he really admired. But the reason why I love this Velázquez painting is because, well, firstly, because of the details, actually. Like, lots of art historians have written about the hands. If I zoom in, you really have to see it in person. But also the way that he paints glass in this painting is really amazing. And then if you go down, like even the way that he paints that red onion and the like shadow that kind of bends underneath the knife, and all of the different types of metal that he paints. Like, technically, this is just such a good painting. Like, he, in this one section that we're looking at, he's basically managed to paint porcelain, metal, and ceramic glazing. And he manages to to make each of those materials distinct so that we know what they are. And you can tell the difference between the skin of the red chili peppers on the left and the red onion on the right. So he's really showing off, you know, like he could have even at least chosen a green onion so that you wouldn't have to necessarily focus so much on the texture to distinguish it. But the whole point of this painting is to, like, you know, just show off about how good he is at painting. And that just goes to show as well that I don't think that Velázquez is one of those overrated painters. Like, he is just so good at painting. I don't know how else you could say it. So yeah, I really love this one. But okay, this is like another tangent now, but I just had to say it. Another one of the reasons why I love this painting is because it inspired lots of feminist art. This is a tangent that we will have to come back to in another week, but I'll just show you now. Basically, what happened in the 20th and 21st century is that the fried egg and the egg became this really important feminist symbol for women artists. for all sorts of reasons, kind of similar to the Surrealists. It had all these connotations of domesticity and nutrition. It's an object that you use in the house, and women felt like they were always cooped up in the house. It's an object that kind of looks like all different types of body parts, so they really played on that. And it's an object that's kind of bigger on the inside than the outside, and women felt like that was a metaphor for their own place in the world. It's an object that is really like strong and fragile at the same time. It's, you know, it's an object that it just has so many different symbolic connotations. I won't go into all of them because we'll be here forever. But if you look at these feminist works alongside Velázquez's Old Women Frying Eggs, you can see that the Brazilian feminist on the left, Ana Mayo Lino Mayo, she like puts the egg between her legs, obviously for all of its other connotations about birth, and she kind of holds it in the same place that Velázquez's Old Woman is holding it as well. So lots of people have looked back to this painting for all sorts of different reasons, but even I think the Velázquez painting in and of itself, it's kind of, in my eyes, I like to interpret it as like a proto-feminist work, because it's really unusual the amount of attention and detail that he gives to this old woman who is also a peasant. You know, he's a court painter, he paints royalty, and yet he's like dedicated time to painting this woman. And it even looks like the little boy next to her is like serving her and almost bowing down to her, and she's totally illuminated, and she's got this side profile that was typically used in royal portraits when kings or queens wanted to look like Roman emperors, because, you know, often you've got that really defined Roman profile. You see it a lot on Roman coins. And he uses it here, this side profile, which has all of these, in the history of art, it has all of these symbolic connotations of power. And he uses it for this woman who is cooking. And I just love it for that reason. I think it's like a work of art that was ahead of its time, even if he didn't mean it in this way. This is how I interpret it. So yeah, this is one of my favorite paintings, but it wasn't the one that I was planning to focus on. So we will come back now to Salvador Dali. And this will kind of take us back to the beginning when we were talking about Charles V and Mexico, because Dali painted this discovery of America by Christopher Columbus. And it also takes inspiration from Velázquez, because he copies the, I don't know what those things are called, spears. He copies the spears that Velázquez includes, and he copies various elements from this painting, the Surrender of Breda, and he incorporates it into his reimagination of the discovery of America. And the Surrender at Breda is actually a different historical moment between, I think I've got it written down actually in my notes. Let me find it. Yeah. It's a painting about Spanish-Dutch relations, and it's a really triumphant moment in Spanish history, when the Dutch king is basically giving the keys to the Spanish king. And anyway, so they're not depicting the same historical moment, is the point that I'm trying to make. But Dali uses this painting because he wants all of its connotations of Spanish greatness and historical greatness. And that's why he kind of incorporates it. And that kind of leads me on to my next point, which is that Dali's discovery of America, this painting was meant to kind of glorify Spanish colonialism, like the very beginning of Spanish colonialism, because Christopher Columbus came before Hernán Cortés, who we talked about last week. he had arrived, he didn't arrive in Mexico, he arrived just below Mexico in what is now Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And he was there by the late 15th century, so kind of 20 years before Hernán Cortés actually arrived in Mexico. But he really paved the way and encouraged the Spanish monarchy to keep paying for these sailors and voyages to the New World. So this is a painting about colonialism, and he does glorify it because he incorporates Velázquez's historical, great paintings of Spain, and he paints all of these glorious religious characters. He actually uses a portrait of his wife as the Virgin Mary. His wife was called Gala, which is very provocative. And I just wanted to include these two other paintings by Dali here to show you that Dali was provocative in his religious paintings. In the painting of Christopher Columbus, he has this very positive view of colonialism and the Christianization of the New World. But in other paintings, he's much more what's the word, derogatory, or I can't think of the word. He's not as complimentary about Catholicism in all of his works of art. So the one on the right, the one on the left is "Sometimes I Spit with Pleasure" on the portrait of my mother, and he kind of envisions his mother as the Virgin Mary, just like he envisions his wife as the Virgin Mary, which was very provocative and blasphemous, and he does that on purpose. But then you've got these other works of art like Christ on the Cross, which are these kind of huge, this painting is massive, huge, glorious Spanish religious paintings. And I've just put on the side the original 1550 image that inspired him. So, this is just to say that Dali was very ambivalent, changed his mind a lot about whether he was a good or a bad Catholic. But what is definitely true about Dali is that he thought colonialism was a good thing. And that was extremely provocative for the Surrealists. Dali is always associated with Surrealism, but the Surrealists actually, they kicked him out of their group because they just disagreed too much with Dali's political views. They were, really anti-imperial. They thought colonialism was a terrible thing. And by contrast, Dali here, he paints Hernán Cortés. You can see him here. He paints Christopher Columbus as this really strong, young teenage boy, bringing Christianity to the New World. So they just hated it. And I must say that this painting is provocative for many, many reasons, because if I go to this slide, I just wanted to include this to say that there aren't that many Spanish paintings of the conquest of the New World. Of course, there are some like this, the conquest of Mexico, but generally it wasn't like the favorite theme of Spanish artists. They preferred to paint Greek mythologies, for example, or something that was kind of less provocative and less contemporary, I suppose. And I just wanted to say that to underline how daring Dali was in the choice of his subject matter, but also to say that that's another reason why the Diego Rivera murals that we looked at last week, that depicted Spanish history in such detail, were so radical and provocative, because it's actually not a subject that you see very often in the history of art. So so Dali really goes for it and tries to depict, he depicts lots of provocative things. And for the Surrealists, this was really off the cards. The Surrealists were a group founded in 1924 between World War I and World War II. They were originally aligned with the communists in Paris. Eventually, they decided in about 1929 that they wanted to be free from any political parties, but nonetheless, they were very left-wing and they were very anti-colonial. And they actually held this exhibition in 1931 called The Truth About the Colonies. And it had all of these quotes by Marx and statistics about violence going on in the colonies in France. And this is a photograph by Claude Quin, who was a French surrealist, who photographs these Aztec masks locked behind glass in the British Museum to kind of criticize the looting of colonial objects. So all of that is just to say that Dali didn't share the same political views as the Surrealists. And he actually, for example, in this painting, included a picture of Hitler. This is called the Enigma of Hitler. And you can see an image of Hitler here. Oh, there we go, it's kind of disappeared. For the Surrealists, this painting was the final straw. They kicked him out of the group because they obviously hated Hitler. And Dali was actually quite sympathetic with him. Even the title, The Enigma of Hitler, just infuriated them because they were like, Hitler is not an enigma. So yes, I just wanted to say that Dali was a very provocative character and actually wasn't a surrealist by, you know, post 1939 because they had officially kicked him out of the group. So, you know, this is kind of another important part of Spanish painting, I suppose. So, I mean, let's see. Oh, I had here actually, this is something I will say. I should include this. One of the very, this is again kind of a tangent, but one of the very earliest Surrealist manifestos, when they were kind of defining themselves as a group, they produced this anti-colonialism pamphlet, and they said, this is a quote: "We fervently hope that wars and colonial insurrection will annihilate Western civilization. We appeal to the we think that the destruction of these states is the least acceptable affair. We take this opportunity to dissociate ourselves publicly from all that is French in action and in words." So they really detested colonialism, which again makes this Dali painting, yeah, all the more provocative. So we've kind of finished in the Golden Age. We finished in the 20th century and looked at all of the different ways in which the 20th century kind of looked back to Spanish history, looked back to the Spanish Golden Age and to Spanish colonial history. And I don't necessarily have time to go into this now, but I just want to note that we've jumped from the Spanish Golden Age to the 20th century, missing out this huge chunk in between, which is the 19th century. And this is one of the centuries in Spanish painting that gets the least attention. And it's the period of kind of Impressionism, and I'm just going to finish with a few paintings here to show you that there were some Spanish Impressionists. But the kind of most important movement of the Spanish 19th century that really gets overlooked is Orientalist painting. And most often people focus on French Orientalist painting, like Delacroix, for example. This is a really famous painting. But I just want to end by showing you some Spanish Orientalist paintings of the 19th century. This was a kind of new era of colonialism in Spain, and they produced so many works of art that, again, are only just starting to be studied. So I will leave you with that, I guess, kind of on a cliff edge of Orientalist painting. We've looked at the most famous Spanish paintings, but also elements of Spanish painting that are not so famous, like Nazareth art or Orientalist art. But Orientalism definitely deserves a whole session alone in its own right. So I will save that for another day, also because it's